Hi guys, this is Bison and today's special game was suggested by our Sigma subscriber Chess by Hermit. This legendary battle was played between Anatoly Karpov and Vladimir Tukmakov in 1973 at the Leningrad Interzonal. And in this game, you will see how Karpov slowly squeezed his opponent, created unstoppable pressure, and finished with a beautiful crushing attack that feels almost unreal. Okay, so this game starts with the Royal Lopez opening, and here black continues with a6, attacking this bishop, which is known as Morphy defense. Okay, so bishop to a4, which is called Columbus variation. Okay, so now h3, and as you can see, this knight on c6 is not doing anything great. And if you think to attack this bishop by, let's suppose, knight to a5, then simply white will go back to this c2 square, and in the next move, white will strike to the center by pushing d4. So that's why, after seeing all of this, simply knight to b8 by Karpov, preparing to push this pawn either to c6 or maybe to c5, so that he can start the flood of pawns. Okay, so now Vladimir strikes with the d4, creating pressure over the e5 pawn, so that's why knight at b goes to d7, and usually white continues with the move knight to d2, which is the classical continuation which covers the e4 pawn. But here, basically, he deviates from this variation. He goes for c4. He's basically hoping that the tension between the c4 and the b5 pawn will result in an open file that white can dominate. And obviously, black cannot capture on c4 because this will also give this strong diagonal to this light square bishop. So that's why here Karpov pushed c6, solidifying this structure. Okay, so now knight to h5, and guys, that's a really good move. He wants to exchange this dark square bishop, which can be a threat for black in the future. I mean, which can be a potent attacker. So by trading it off, black eases the cramp in his position. And you can also see this bishop is cut off from the queen side, so that's why exchanging it will be the best option. And let's suppose if this dark square bishop was defended by this queen, just suppose, so in that case, we would not exchange the bishop because by that, white will place this queen on h4, which will be bad for black. Okay, so now here simply white exchanges the bishop, and after that he exchanges on b5, a takes b5, and by this exchange, you can see now black ends up with this open a file for this rook. And here b4 by Karpov, he attacks this knight, and obviously this knight on a4 will be bad for white. So that's why here the best move for white is to bring this knight back to e2 square, so that he can maintain an eye over the d4 pawn, as well as also stopping this knight from coming to f4. And let's suppose if he tries to attack this center pawn, simply d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, because we doesn't want to just disrupt this structure. So that's why now comes bishop to d5, attacking this rook, rook to b8, queen to d2. And in the next move, rook to d1, and you can see white will be slightly better, because just look at this position of this bishop. I mean, it's placed perfectly and permanently on the d5 square. But in the actual game, after the move b4, here Vladimir made a mistake by knight to b1. Basically, he wants to go for knight to d2, but before that, knight to f4 by Karpov. And now just look at the position of this octopus knight, which targets the important key squares. And obviously white cannot push this pawn to g3 because it will also weakens the king. Okay, so now knight to e5, and now there are multiple ways. You can see now there are multiple threats which black is creating, like to sacrifice this bishop on h3, and after that he will go for this queen to h5, queen to g5 check. So to tackle this, rook to e3 was recommended for white, but instead he brings this knight to f3, asking for knight exchange. And queen to f6 by Karpov, and again which defends this queen. And again you can see now black is threatening to sack this bishop. Yeah, basically by bishop takes h3. I mean, let's suppose if white is not careful and he goes for any another move, like let's suppose this queen goes there. Now comes this amazing move, which is bishop takes h3. And if you let's suppose captured this, now comes this check. And wherever this queen goes, in all the case, you can see this will be a checkmate. So that's why after this move, which is queen to f6, here white firstly exchanges the knight, and then he goes for knight to f5, cutting the diagonal of this bishop. And here Karpov made an inaccuracy by bishop takes f5. Basically, he simplifies the position, but instead of this move, which is bishop takes f5, the best move for black is to go for rook to d8, attacking this queen. And let's suppose if this queen goes to f3, now comes rook to d3, attacking this queen again. And obviously you cannot go to this g4 square due to the threat of h5, which will trap this queen. So that's why the only move is rook to e3, but after that rook to d2, attacking this b2 pawn. And if white defends it by, let's suppose, rook to b1, now comes bishop to a6 with the idea of bishop to e2, which attacks this queen. And you can see black will be doing great. Okay, so in the actual game, after this move bishop takes f5, he captured this bishop. But and now comes rook at a goes to d8, attacking this queen. And guys, basically now comes rook to d2 by Karpov. And yes, this position looks similar, but due to the absence of this knight, yeah, basically due to the absence of this knight on f5, you can see this position will be now close to equal, because previously this knight was targeting on this e3 square, through where white could not place this rook on e3. But since there is no knight on f5, so that's why rook to e3. And you can see now black cannot attack this queen. And here white doubles his rook, creating more pressure over the e5 pawn. So to defend this, Karpov brings his rook to e8. And here rook to e4 by white. Basically, he wants to capture this knight so that he can capture the rook on e8, taking benefit of this pinned e5 pawn. But guys, that's an inaccuracy because now Karpov finds the best move, which is knight to d5. A great move by Karpov, and this single move basically blocks the diagonal of this bishop, as well as now white cannot capture on e file. And for white, here the move queen to g4 was recommended, uh, but instead, yeah, basically this move is recommended with the idea of pushing f4, trying to open the e file. Yeah, so basically you can see this is recommended, but after knight to d5, he made a mistake by going to g3. And yes, he's basically creating pressure over the e5 pawn. But guys, now I just want you all to pause the video and try to find the next crazy move played by Karpov. Okay, so in this position, here Karpov finds the only best move, which is knight to c3, attacking this rook. And let's suppose if white decides to capture this rook on e5 by, let's suppose, with this move, rook takes e5. Now comes this check. Knight to the now knight can go to this e2 square with a check, and you can see now white is forced to capture this rook. But after that, simply takes, 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 and yeah, that's all. So that's why after the move knight to c3, one thing is clear, that white cannot capture this pawn. So that's why he captured the b4 pawn. And after that, knight to e2 check. Rook takes e2, rook takes e2, and now you can see white can, yeah, so basically here white can continue with the move this queen to g6, taking benefit of this pinned f7 pawn, trying to exchange the queen, but instead he goes for rook to b7, creating pressure over the f7 pawn. But simply rook to e7, rook to b8 check, king to h7, and since black is now threatening to give a check, so that's why king to f1, attacking this rook. And in this position, the final move by Karpov is rook to d2. And here Vladimir Tukmakov resigned, because as you can see now, there is nothing which white can do to save this game, because first of all, white is a rook up, and secondly, this deadly combination of this queen and both rooks are just crazy, which is ready to rip off the black position. I mean, you can see now there is nothing which white can do to save this game. What an amazing game by Karpov. Like this video, and I will see you in the next one. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.